Hi there, this is Centurions from Centurions Films, and welcome to another episode of In the Frame. Today's In the Frame, I'm taking a look at George C. Scott, an actor that I always claim I'm not the biggest fan of, even though I do have a few of his films, and the films that I do have are amongst my favourites of all time. Now, I don't have Patton. I don't think I've ever actually seen Patton. Is one of his most famous performances. He's also played Fagin. He's also played Mussolini. He is perhaps not the most subtle of actors. He's probably a level down from Rod Steiger as far as explosions of histrionics, but I do prefer him to Rod Steiger. He does have his quiet moments, but a lot of the time we do enjoy seeing George C. Scott when he goes full blown George C. Scott. He has a physical presence. He is quite a large man. So I'm just going to talk about a few of his films that I have. I do have The Hustler, but I can't seem to find my DVD of it. I don't even have The Hustler on Blu-ray, as he plays a slimy character, which he has done a few times in his career. We won't start with the sublime, we'll start with the ridiculous. And the 90s remake of 12 Angry Men, starring Jack Lemmon amongst others. This is directed by William Friedkin. The script is pretty much the same as the Sidney Lumet version from 1957, which most people agree is a classic. You could argue the 97 version has a better director on paper, and you could argue certainly that the cast is more impressive than the 57 version. So you have Jack Lemmon, but you also have Ossie Davis, Armin Mueller-Stahl, James Gandolfini, Tony Danza, Courtney B. Vance, Edward James Olmos, Dorian Harewood, Hume Cronin, William Peterson, and Michael T. Williamson, along with George C. Scott. So the cast is pretty amazing, but for some reason it doesn't quite work. I did a double take video on both versions of 12 Angry Men a couple of years ago. You can go dig that one up if you so choose. And it's a perfect example of a remake that has a good director, good script, great cast, but doesn't quite work. Perhaps because it's in colour, perhaps it was made when, as far as I'm aware, in America there wasn't such a thing as men-only juries. But I think there's something about Jack Lemmon in the Henry Fonda role. Now, don't get me wrong, I absolutely adore Jack Lemmon, and one of these days I'll do an In the Frame episode on Jack Lemmon. But Jack Lemmon in the Henry Fonda role just doesn't kind of work. Henry Fonda, because of his stature, his height, the way Henry Fonda moves around the room in 12 Angry Men, the way he almost glides. You know, Jack Lemmon is more a kind of... he's more a kind of everyman. Obviously, he was made to be Shelley the Machine Levine in Glengarry Glen Ross. He was made for that role. You couldn't see Henry Fonda playing Shelley Levine. I just feel Jack Lemmon, as much as I love Jack Lemmon, just isn't that character in 12 Angry Men. George C. Scott plays the Lee J. Cobb character, who, strange enough, it wouldn't be the last time that he would play a character initially played by Lee J. Cobb. We'll get to that later. And Lee J. Cobb himself was almost George C. Scott before George C. Scott, because you were always watching a Lee J. Cobb film for him to burst and to explode in a rage. And I feel George C. Scott in 12 Angry Men, he almost goes into that anger too soon. I mean, Lee J. Cobb in 12 Angry Men, it's kind of the latter stages before he blows his top. You can always sense there's something burning because it's Lee J. Cobb. But I feel George C. Scott's performance in the Lee J. Cobb role, he kind of gets to that point too quickly. So he's like furious from almost like the start of the film. So it's little things like that despite the great cast, the remake with Friedkin, which is a TV movie, which I think is actually coming out on Blu-ray, doesn't quite work, and it is more of a film to watch just out of interest rather than a film that you'd actually revisit and actually love, because let's be honest, you're going to go back to the 1957 Henry Fonda film. So again, these are in no particular order, because we're jumping back to 1968 for Richard Lester's Patchouli with Julie Christie. I'm a big Richard Lester fan, but Patchouli is one of his films I'm really going to have to revisit again, because it didn't really blow me away the first time I watched it as much as his other films have. Perhaps it's the subject matter, George C. Scott playing essentially a square, and he kind of falls for Julie Christie, who's a lot younger and is more hip, and it's really about that clash of cultures in the late 60s, and Richard Lester just goes full on Richard Lester. But for me, it didn't quite hook me the way things like How I Won the War and Robin Hood Made Merry, which is also a different film. But again, I'm going to have to rewatch it, because George C. Scott most of the time is like confused and rubbing his head a lot and exploding quite a bit, but generally looking bemused throughout the whole film. But it's one I'm definitely going to have to rewatch. Next is Anatomy of a Murder by Otto Preminger. This is the Criterion. This is from 1959. So this is young George C. Scott. He's only in a small role here as State's Attorney Claude Dancer. I mean, he's not even on the front of the cast list, but you could argue, with the exception of James Stewart, George C. Scott probably walks away with the film. Again, he's just got that sliminess, but he's also got that snake-like charm to him, as he's almost kind of flirting with Lee Remick when he's questioning her on the witness stand. It's one of those little roles in a film that kind of get you noticed, and I think that was what happened with George C. Scott in that, because he's certainly one of the more memorable things in Preminger's film, which for me is a little too long, but it's still a very good film, obviously. And then next, it's kind of wonderful broad comedy for George C. Scott, as Buck Turgidson in Dr. Strangelove. This is George C. Scott doing full comedy, and he does it so well. He's absolutely hilarious in this film, and it's a kind of role that he didn't really repeat that much. I mean, obviously, I am not a George C. Scott expert, because remember, I'm not really a big fan of George C. Scott, and I'm sure people in the comments will tell me of all the comedies he was in. I need to see The Hospital, for example, which I haven't seen. But he's just so good as Buck Churchison. He really captures that kind of militaristic buffoonery really well. He has several classic scenes when he talks about how successful the bomber will be, and then he realises he's went a little bit too far. He's absolutely wonderful in Doctor Strangelove. And then he does a bit of horror in The Changeling. Peter Medak, who's an interesting director in himself. From 1980, this is the second sight, limited edition, but you can also always get the standard edition. This is a lovely little ghost story that will give you the willies a couple of times. There's a wonderful scene involving a wheelchair and another scene involving a ball, which are quite effective. George C. Scott plays a widow. A widow? That's an interesting role. He plays a widower who's lost his wife and daughter in a car accident, and he is a pianist. And he moves into this old house that is haunted, and he wants to get to the bottom of the haunting. And it's just a wonderful, chilly little film, directed admirably by Peter Medak, who, like I say, is a quite interesting director himself. Next, we're going to go into some indicators. The first one is Paul Schrader's Hardcore, or The Hardcore Life, is that the way it was? It's alternate title. From 1979, about a father from a religious community up north whose daughter goes missing and ends up trying to track her down in the sleazy underworld of porn and brothels and such. This is a classic George C. Scott performance, full of angst. There's memes who use the scene when he's in the cinema watching his daughter perform in a porn film. He goes full blown with rubbing his head and shaking the seat in front and crying and making strange noises. It's classic George C. Scott. The film features another wonderful sleazy performance by Peter Boyle, and it has one of the best kind of anti-choreographed fight scenes where he scuffles with somebody down some stairs, lots of garbage bins, and it just looks so rough and loose. I mean, it probably was choreographed, but it just looks that way that it just wasn't, so they like fall over bins, and it's just so well done. Again, I don't know whether he got Oscars for it. Again, I'm not really up on who got Oscars for what. But it's a seminal George C. Scott performance. Then one of my all-time favourite Indicator releases is the new Centurions. This really sums up Indicator, a film at the time I'd never heard of by Richard Fleischer, also starring Stacey Keach, and it's essentially Hill Street Blues in film form before Hill Street Blues. It's a cop film which is just about day-to-day cop stuff. There is no big villain, there is no plot particularly. It's so refreshing, so amazing. George C. Scott plays the veteran who's teaching the kid Stacey Keach about the streets and how to survive in the streets. It's just a wonderful, wonderful film. And George C. Scott is wonderful in it. And there's a scene with a static camera which goes on for about 10-12 minutes, I think, something like that. And it's one of the greatest scenes in cinema history. George C. Scott's just wonderful in it. Stacey Keach is really good in it as well. It's such a great little film, and it's a total indicator. It's one of my favourite indicators, one of the first. It's spy number 13 in the indicators, and it's one of the ones that made me fall in love with the indicator label and range. And here's another one that perfectly sums up indicator. It's Day of the Dolphin, directed by Mike Nichols. And this is George C. Scott as somebody who trains dolphins and is getting them to speak English. Yep. And from 1973, as I say, directed by Mike Nichols. Also stars Paul Sorvino, amongst others. And then the government get interested, or the military get interested, and they want to use his dolphins for nefarious means. And obviously George C. Scott is furious about it. Apparently there's wonderful extras about the making of the film and how difficult George C. Scott can sometimes be. But it is, again, a wonderful, odd, strange little film, and another perfect indicator release. So if you want something a little bit different, then George C. Scott training dolphins to speak English. And then finally, again, I'm obviously not a huge George C. Scott fan because I don't have hundreds of his films. But finally, he's arguably my favourite, is The Exorcist 3, William Peter Blatty's Exorcist sequel, or Legion. Again, I'm weird. Exorcist 3 for me is the best in the Exorcist series, the same way Halloween 3 is the best in the Halloween series. That's just my opinion. This is the Arrow, lovely Arrow edition, which has a theatrical cut and the director's cut. Obviously prefer the director's cut because it doesn't have the silly added on exorcism scene that the studio desperately wanted. They wanted to disown the Exorcist franchise after Exorcist 2, but then they changed their mind and let's have an exorcism, let's stick an exorcism in it. It has the greatest scene in cinema history involving shears. It is sheer entertainment. But George C. Scott, again, he's playing the cop who was originally played by Lee J. Cobb in the 1971 or 73. I can't even remember the original Exorcist because I'm not really that much of a fan of it. 73. So it's George C. Scott playing Lee J. Cobb again. But this time he's absolutely marvellous. His relationship with the priest, played by Ed Flanders, not Ned Flanders, always get them mixed up, one of them is a cartoon character. His relationship, the banter between George C. Scott and Ed Flanders is amongst the best banter in cinema history. The story of the carp in his bath is just one of the greatest scenes of all time. The film itself is just full of dread, and it's like you can almost feel the chill through the screen. But don't worry, George C. Scott does explode at several points, with hilarious results. We get the full gamut of George C. Scott in this. We do get real emotion. I won't go into spoilers, but things happen and he gives us real emotion, and he also has a couple of explosions of George C. Scott goodness that come out. It's just a wonderful film. Sadly, because of the different cuts, the quality and picture quality kind of dips when they're trying to glue the whole thing together again. But it's a wonderful, wonderful film despite its flaws. It is one of my favourite films of all time, and therefore George C. Scott is in certainly a few of my favourite films of all time. Doctor Strangelove, where he's absolutely hilarious. Exorcist 3. the new Centurions is absolutely wonderful. So thanks very much for watching this short In the Frame of George C. Scott. I know people out there in the comments section will know a lot more and be able to recommend a lot more George C. Scott films than this little pile that I have. As I say, I'm not a huge fan of George C. Scott, but I do love quite a lot of his films that I have. So thanks very much for watching. Again, please leave comments below of the George C. Scott performances that are your favourite and the George C. Scott films that I am missing out on that I should watch. Again, is Patton worth watching? You can let me know. Or his Mussolini, is that worth watching? You can let me know. And hopefully you'll join me again for more episodes of In the Frame as time passes, like a big linear thing. So thanks very much for watching. This is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, saying careful what you do with garden shears, and farewell.